concerned about? When I chaired the Homeland Security Committee, it was during the rise of ISIS and the Caliphate. Are you worried about that phenomenon happening in the Sahel right now, and how sophisticated could they be in terms of external operations?
When the West feels like it's losing influence in a rich region like Africa, instead of accepting it, it labels the powerful leaders of those countries as a threat. But shouldn't the West be clearer? Are these leaders a threat to security or a threat to Western control? The West thinks labeling these leaders as threats will give them a reason to act against them. But is it fair to call a leader defending their country a threat? Why is the West using this term? What are they trying to achieve? Let's find out. The West is losing control of the Sahel region because of the strong leaders, and they are calling it a crisis. A House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on the Sahel in crisis was conducted. And what was the main highlight of the sitting? The House Foreign Affairs Committee recently held a hearing on the Sahel region, where Congressman McCall played a prominent role in expressing concerns and raising critical questions. One of the primary topics of discussion was centered around the African Sahel Junta leaders and their level of sophistication, particularly in the context of their potential for external operations. Congressman McCall's apprehensions shed light on the dynamics of the Sahel region, where, according to him, the presence of these leaders has raised security concerns for the West. The committee delved into an in-depth analysis of the capabilities and intentions of the African Sahel Junta leaders, trying to gauge the extent of the threat they pose and their capacity for actions beyond the region. Well, in simple words, they don't want the Sahel to have such strong leaders that can pose a threat to the West. What specific concerns were expressed regarding the potential for external operations by African Sahel Junta leaders? A significant point of concern during the hearing revolved around the potential for external operations by African Sahel Junta leaders. Congressman McCall and other committee members delved into the nuances of the leaders' capabilities and intentions, trying to assess the extent to which they could pose a threat beyond the Sahel region. The discussion explored the factors that could facilitate or hinder the ability of African Sahel Junta leaders to carry out external operations. This line of inquiry aimed to understand the implications of such activities on regional and global security. The committee members sought to evaluate the level of coordination and collaboration needed among international stakeholders to address the multifaceted challenges posed by Sahel-based groups' potential expansion of operations. Beyond the immediate concerns discussed, the committee also engaged in a broader examination of the implications of the Sahel crisis on U.S. policy options. This encompassed exploring potential strategies, diplomatic efforts, and policy frameworks that the United States could employ to contribute to stability and security in the Sahel region. The discussion delved into the role of the United States in addressing the root causes of the crisis, promoting regional cooperation, and enhancing the capacity of local actors to manage security challenges. But is the U.S. concerned about security, or is it losing dominance? Committee members sought to identify concrete policy options that could be pursued by the U.S. government to effectively respond to the complex and evolving situation in the Sahel. What were the key takeaways regarding the sophistication of African Sahel Junta leaders? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. One of the central themes of the committee hearing was the assessment of the sophistication of African Sahel Junta leaders. Committee members aimed to discern the level of training, organization, and capabilities these leaders possess, focusing on their potential for external operations. The discussion encompassed intelligence assessments, expert testimonies, and analyses of the activities and tactics employed by African Sahel Junta leaders. The goal was to provide an understanding of the threat landscape in the Sahel region and to inform future policy decisions on how best to address the challenges posed by these leaders. Why does the United States express concern about military forces in the Sahel region? What does it have to do with this region? Is the concern about losing dominance of the region? The United States expressed concern about military forces in the Sahel region stems from a perceived unease regarding the effective military capacities of African nations, with a particular focus on the Sahel. The concerns appear to be rooted in a strategic assessment of the potential consequences of these nations developing strong military capabilities. A notable suggestion accompanying the U.S. concern is that the United States may prefer to keep African nations divided and entangled in internal conflicts, especially those in the Sahel region. The implication is that such internal conflicts could serve as a means to prevent these nations from achieving substantial military strength. This suggests the strategic United States sees a divided and conflicted Sahel as more aligned with its interests. And that makes Western leaders call these leaders a threat. Why does the U.S. fear African nations developing formidable military forces? The fear driving the U.S. concern is the perceived threat that could arise if African nations, particularly those in the Sahel, develop formidable military forces. The United States appears apprehensive about the strategic implications of having powerful military actors in the region. There is a concern that such military strength could potentially threaten the strategic interests of the United States, leading to an assessment that actively seeks to prevent the emergence of strong military capabilities among African nations. The discussion around the U.S. concern implies a vision where formidable African military forces could jeopardize the strategic interests of the United States. We did not explicitly outline the specifics of these strategic interests. Still, it could include concerns about regional stability, resource access, or the balance of power in the broader geopolitical landscape. The fear is that powerful African military forces might act in ways that counter U.S. interests, necessitating a proactive approach to prevent such developments. In what ways does the U.S. express this concern and take action to prevent the development of strong military capabilities in the Sahel? The expression of concern by the United States will likely manifest through diplomatic channels, strategic partnerships, and possibly military assistance programs. The U.S. may engage in discussions with African nations to shape their military strategies, or provide support that aligns with its interests. Additionally, diplomatic efforts may involve mediating or influencing internal conflicts to ensure that they do not lead to the strengthening of military capabilities in the Sahel. While the United States' approach to preventing the development of strong military capabilities in African nations, particularly in the Sahel, may be driven by its strategic interests, there are potential consequences to consider. Such an approach may inadvertently perpetuate internal conflicts, impeding the overall development and stability of the region. Additionally, it could strain diplomatic relations and potentially lead to mistrust between the United States and African nations. And the U.S. is trying out ways to weaken Africa. Is there an allegation of the U.S. sponsoring or creating terrorist organizations? Allegations of the United States sponsoring or creating terrorist organizations have been made by Iranian leaders, pointing fingers at the U.S. for its alleged involvement in the formation of ISIS and fostering instability in the Middle East. The accusations suggest significant skepticism and suspicion regarding the U.S.'s role in certain geopolitical events. What evidence supports the claim of the U.S. creating or supporting ISIS? The allegations against the U.S. have concrete evidence. Experts argue that the U.S. indirectly contributed to the rise of ISIS through its actions in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. contends that such claims are politically motivated and lack a factual basis. How do African leaders perceive the U.S. role in sponsoring terrorism? Beyond the Middle East, African leaders have also expressed concerns about the U.S. allegedly sponsoring terrorism. However, these assertions have universally accepted evidence similar to the Middle Eastern claims. African leaders who raise these concerns often point to Western allies, including the U.S., as contributors to instability on the continent. How do U.S. officials argue against allegations of sponsoring or creating terrorist organizations? U.S. officials often counter allegations of sponsoring or creating terrorist organizations by asserting that such claims are rooted in geopolitical motivations. Understanding the arguments put forth by U.S. officials sheds light on the government's perspective and provides insights into how they frame the discourse surrounding these allegations. The claim that accusations against the U.S. serve as a tool for certain nations to advance their interests or divert attention from domestic issues raises questions about the motivations behind these allegations. Examining specific instances and patterns can offer insights into how geopolitical dynamics may influence the framing of allegations against the U.S. If what Africa is saying is motivated by self-interest, why can't the U.S. actions in Africa be motivated by self-interest too? Let's review the question. What prompts the U.S. to express concern about security matters in Africa, and how does it manifest in its actions? The U.S. reacts strongly when Africa expresses concerns, implying that this reaction is rooted in the U.S.'s interests. Investigating specific instances and the nature of U.S. reactions to African statements provides a deeper understanding of the dynamics and motivations behind the U.S. response. What motivations underlie U.S. actions in response if Africa's words are seen as motivated by geopolitical interests? Examining the perceived geopolitical motivations behind Africa's statements and comparing them with U.S. actions allows for a comparative analysis. The U.S. is not genuinely concerned about Africa, but is driven by its interests. What is the U.S. government's response to these allegations? The U.S. government consistently denies allegations of sponsoring or creating terrorist organizations. Officials maintain that such claims are baseless and lack credible evidence. The U.S. often attributes these accusations to geopolitical rivalries and attempts to tarnish its global image. Examining the official responses from the U.S. government provides insight into the diplomatic dynamics surrounding these allegations. How do experts assess the likelihood of U.S. involvement in sponsoring terrorism? Experts offer varying perspectives on the likelihood of U.S. involvement in sponsoring terrorism. Some argue that the U.S. may have indirectly contributed to the rise of certain groups due to its foreign policy decisions, while others dismiss such claims as conspiracy theories. But watching the history of exploitation, it is more believable that the U.S. is involved in illegal activities to control Africa. To comprehend the context surrounding allegations of U.S. sponsorship of terrorism, it is essential to examine the role of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and Africa. Historical interventions, military actions, and geopolitical strategies have shaped the perception of the U.S. in these regions. Analyzing the consequences of U.S. foreign policy provides a broader understanding of the complexities involved in the allegations against the country. Allegations of the U.S. sponsoring or creating terrorist organizations are not unprecedented. Throughout history, the U.S. has faced accusations of supporting groups for geopolitical reasons. Now, let's come to the main question. Why are the U.S. and West both scared of the Sahel region's new leaders? The Sahel region, a vast stretch of semi-arid land spanning across Africa, has been gaining increased attention from the global community, particularly the United States and Western nations. The focus has shifted toward the emerging leaders in this region. Are sophisticated leaders a cause for concern? One primary reason contributing to the concern is characterizing the Sahel region's leaders as sophisticated. The adjective sophisticated implies political sense, strategic thinking, and diplomatic prowess that can potentially reshape the region's dynamics. These leaders are seen as individuals capable of navigating complex geopolitical landscapes and advocating for the interests of their nations on the global stage. The notion of sophistication raises concerns in the West and the U.S., as it suggests that the Sahel leaders are not easily swayed or manipulated. In the past, Africa has often been a target for exploitation by external powers, with the continent's vast resources becoming subjects of economic and political interests. The emergence of sophisticated leaders in the Sahel region implies a potential shift in power dynamics, challenging the traditional narrative of external dominance. Can Sahel leaders take a stand for Africa? Another significant factor contributing to Western apprehension is the assertion that the Sahel leaders can take a stand for Africa. This declaration implies a commitment to prioritizing the interests and well-being of the African continent over external influences, particularly those from the West and the U.S. Historically, Africa has faced exploitation and intervention from foreign powers, leading to economic and political instability. The suggestion that Sahel leaders can take a stand for Africa raises concerns among Western nations, as it threatens their historical dominance and influence. The fear is that these leaders may resist external pressures and prioritize the development and autonomy of their nations and, by extension, the entire African continent. Does the rise of sophisticated leaders limit Western exploitation? One of the underlying fears driving Western concern is the potential limitation on their ability to exploit Africa. The historical narrative of Western powers exploiting African resources, often to the detriment of the local populations, is well documented. The emergence of sophisticated leaders in the Sahel region signals a possible end to this exploitative dynamic. Sophisticated leaders are perceived as individuals who can negotiate on equal terms, defend their nation's interests, and resist external exploitation. This challenges the traditional approach of Western powers, viewing Africa as a source of raw materials and geopolitical leverage. The fear that the Sahel leaders may actively work to protect their nations from exploitation disrupts the established order, prompting concerns about the economic implications for Western nations. How does the West perceive the changing dynamics? Western nations view the changing dynamics in the Sahel region, marked by the rise of sophisticated leaders, through a lens of uncertainty. The prospect of leaders prioritizing national interests and standing against external exploitation challenges the status quo that has long favored Western powers. The West has historically influenced African affairs, often shaping policies and exploiting resources to meet their interests. The emergence of leaders who may challenge this influence prompts a reassessment of geopolitical strategies. The fear of losing control over African resources and facing resistance to external interventions motivates Western apprehension. And why do the U.S. and the West fear military development in the Sahel region? The fear surrounding military development in the Sahel region has become a prominent concern for the United States and Western nations. How does a strong military deter external involvement? One primary reason contributing to Western apprehension is the belief that a strong military in the Sahel region would hinder the intervention of the U.S. and the West in African affairs. A robust military presence is a deterrent that can resist external involvement and protect the region's autonomy. This implies that a powerful military in the Sahel would limit the ability of Western nations to assert their influence and agendas within the region. Historically, Africa has been a target for external interventions, with Western powers often intervening in conflicts or influencing political developments. The fear is that a strong military in the Sahel would disrupt this pattern, establishing the region as a self-reliant and secure entity capable of resisting external pressures. Can military strength make the Sahel region more resilient? The notion that a strong military in the Sahel would resist external pressure aligns with making the region more resilient. Resilience in this context implies the ability of the Sahel nations to withstand external interference and protect their interests against geopolitical influences. Western nations fear that a militarily fortified Sahel region would be less susceptible to external manipulation, ensuring its nations can chart their course without undue interference. This resilience challenges the traditional narrative of external powers shaping African affairs, raising concerns about the potential loss of influence and control. How does military strength impact external pressure? The fear of military development in the Sahel is closely linked to the idea that a strong military would resist external pressure from the U.S. and the West. Historically, African nations have faced various forms of pressure, from economic exploitation to political influence. The prospect of a Sahel region with a formidable military raises concerns that attempts to exert pressure or control may be met with resistance. The fear is that a strong military presence would allow the Sahel nations to negotiate on equal terms and protect their sovereignty. This resistance to external pressure challenges the established norms of Western powers, shaping the African narrative to meet their interests. The U.S. and the West, accustomed to a certain level of influence, find this prospect unsettling. Does military strength in the Sahel create competition? The fear of a new competitor emerging in the market is another aspect driving Western apprehension. A militarily strong Sahel region represents a potential competitor to the established influence of the U.S. and the West in African affairs. The emergence of a self-reliant region that can resist external pressures introduces competition for resources, alliances, and strategic positioning. Western nations, accustomed to being major players in African geopolitics, are wary of the Sahel region becoming a new competitor for influence. The fear is that military strength in the Sahel could shift the balance of power and alliances, creating challenges for Western interests in the region. What are the implications for U.S. and Western influence? The implications of military development in the Sahel region are significant for the U.S. and Western nations. A strengthened military presence challenges the traditional narrative of external dominance and influence in African affairs. The fear is that the Sahel region, with its military capabilities, may align with other global powers or pursue a path that diverges from Western interests. For the U.S. and the West, the Sahel region holds strategic importance, and the emergence of a strong military complicates existing geopolitical strategies. The fear of losing influence, facing resistance, and encountering competition prompts apprehension about the future role of Western powers in the Sahel. Do you think the West can control African regions now? What is the point of even saying they are a security threat? Let us know in the comment section if it would be better to say that the strong African leaders limit the West's ability to exploit Africa, which is scaring the West. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If yes, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.